Good morning, friends. We're reading chapter 19, High Places. Grace and Glory, with her handmaidens, Joy and Peace, stayed up on the high places for several weeks while all three explored the heights and learnt many new lessons from the king. He led them himself to many places and explained to them as much as they were able to understand at that time. He also encouraged them to explore on their own, for there are always new and lovely discoveries to make up there on the high places. Even these high places were not the highest of all. Others towered above them into the sky, where mortal eye could no longer follow them, and where only those who have finished their pilgrim life on earth are able to go. Grace and Glory and her friends were on the lowest, the beginner slopes in the kingdom of love, and these were the parts which they were to explore and enjoy at this time. From these slopes, too, they were able to look down on the valleys below, and from that new viewpoint gain an understanding of many things which had been puzzling and mysterious to them before. From beneath they had not been seen clearly, and even then only a small part had been visible. The first thing, however, which they realized up there on the slopes of the kingdom of love was how much more there would be to see and learn and understand when the king took them higher on future occasions. The glorious view which they now enjoyed was but small in comparison with all that lay beyond, and would be visible only from yet higher places above. It was now perfectly evident to them that there must be ranges upon ranges of which they had never dreamt, while they were still down in the narrow valleys with their extraordinarily limited views. Sometimes, as she looked on the glorious panorama visible from these lowest slopes in the kingdom of love, she found herself blushing as she remembered some of the dogmatic statements which she and others had made in the depths of the valley about the high places and the ranges of truth. They had been able to see so little and were so unconscious of what lay beyond and above. If that had been the case while down in the valley, how much more clearly she now realized that even up on those wondrous slopes she was only looking out on a tiny corner of the whole. She never tired of looking from the glorious new viewpoint on the first slopes of the kingdom of love and seeing it all from a new perspective. What she could see and could take in almost intoxicated her with joy and thanksgiving, and sometimes even with inexpressible relief. Things which she had thought dark and terrible, and which had made her tremble as she looked up from the valley, because they had seemed so alien to any part of the realm of love, were now seen to be but parts of a great and wonderful whole. They were so altered and modified that as she saw what they extended into, she wondered at having been so blind and stupid at having had such false ideas about them. She began to understand quite clearly that truth cannot be understood from books alone, or by any written words, but only by personal growth and development in understanding, and that things written even in the book of books can be astonishingly misunderstood while one still lives on the low levels of spiritual experience and on the wrong side of the grave on the mountains. She perceived that no one who finds herself up on the slopes of the kingdom of love can possibly dogmatize about what is seen there, because it is only then that she comprehends how small a part of the glorious whole she sees. All she can do is to gasp with wonder, awe, and thanksgiving, and to long with all her heart to go higher and to see and understand more. Paradoxical as it may seem, as she gazed out on dazzling vistas so glorious that she could not look at them steadily or grasp their magnificent sweep, she often thought that the prayer which best expressed her heart's desire was that of the blind man. Lord, that I may receive my sight, help me to open myself to more light, help me to fuller understanding. Another thing which gave her continual joy was their unbroken communion with the king. Wherever he went, she and peace and joy went too, springing behind him with a delight which at times was almost hilarious, for he was teaching and training them to use their hinds feet. Grace and Glory quickly saw, however, that he always chose the way most carefully and restrained his own amazing strength and power, taking only such springs and bounds as they could manage too. So graciously did he adapt himself to what was possible to their newly acquired capacity that they scarcely recognized in the exhilaration of leaping and skipping like hinds on the mountains that had he really extended his powers, they would have been left behind completely. For Grace and Glory, who had been lame and limping all her life, the ecstasy of leaping about in this way and of bounding from rock to rock on the high places as easily as the mountain rose was so rapturous that she could hardly bear to cease from it even for rest. The king seemed to find great delight in encouraging this, and led her on and on, taking longer and longer leaps, until at last she would be quite breathless. Then, as they sat side by side on some new crag to which he had led her, while she rested, he would point out some of the vistas to be seen from the new viewpoint. On one of these occasions, after they had been up on the high places for several days, she flung herself down on the lichen and moss-covered crag to which he had led her, and laughing and breathless, said, "Even Hinds' feet seem to need a rest now and then." "Grace and Glory," he answered, "do you think you understand now how I was able to make your feet like Hinds' feet and set you on these high places?" She drew closer to him and looked earnestly in his face and asked, "How were you able to do this, my lord and king?" "Think back over the journey you made," he replied, "and tell me what lessons you learnt on the way." She was silent for a while as she reviewed the whole journey, which had seemed so terribly long, and in some places so cruelly difficult and even impossible. She thought of the altars which she had built along the way, of the time when she had stood with him at the trysting place in the valley, when he had called her to follow him to the heights. She remembered the walk to the foot of the mountains, the first meeting with suffering and sorrow, and of learning to accept their help. She recalled the shock of what had seemed such a heartbreaking detour down into the desert, and of the things which she had seen there. Then their journey along the shores of loneliness, the empty cove which the sea had filled to the brim, and then the agony of disappointment and frustration experienced in the wilderness, when the path once again had turned away from the high places. She remembered crossing the great sea wall, walking through the woods and valleys until the rapturous moment when the path had turned back toward the mountains. Her thoughts turned to the precipice of injury, the forest of danger and tribulation, the great storm during which they had sheltered in the hut, and then the mist, the endless mist, and the awful moment when the path suddenly led down into the valley of loss, and the nightmare abyss of horror into which she had looked back when she had thought of turning back. She recalled the descent down into the valley of loss, and the peace she had found there before reascending to the heights in the aerial chairs, and of the days spent in that place where she had been prepared for her burial. Then that last agonizing ascent, and the cave where they sheltered from the floods, and where she had been tempted to cast away the promises. Then the spring called Mara, and finally the mist-shrouded grave up among the peaks where she had been bound to the altar. How little she had imagined when she first set out on that strange journey what lay ahead of her, and the things which she would be called upon to pass through. So for a long time she sat silent, remembering, wondering, and thankful. At last she put her hand in his and said softly, "My lord, I will tell you what I learnt." "Tell me," he answered gently. "First," said she, "I learnt that I must accept with joy all that you allowed to happen to me on the way, and everything to which the path led me. That I was never to try to evade it, but to accept it, and to lay down my own will on the altar and say, 'Behold me, I am thy little handmaiden, acceptance with joy.'" He nodded without speaking, and she went on. "Then I learnt that I must bear all that others were allowed to do against me, and to forgive with no trace of bitterness, and to say to thee, 'Behold me, I am thy little handmaiden bearing with love,' that I may receive power to bring good out of this evil." Again he nodded, and she smiled still more sweetly and happily. "The third thing that I learnt was that you, my lord, never regarded me as actually was, lame and weak and crooked and cowardly. You saw me as I would be when you had done what you promised, and had brought me to the high places, when it could be truly said, 'There is none that walks with such queenly ease, nor with such grace as she.' You always treated me with the same love and graciousness, as though I were a queen already, and not wretched little Much Afraid." Then she looked up into his face for a little time, could say no more, but at last she added, "My lord, I cannot tell you how greatly I want to regard others in the same way." A very lovely smile broke out on his face at that, but he still said nothing, only nodded for the third time and waited for her to continue. "The fourth thing," she said with a radiant face, "was really the first I learnt up here. Every circumstance in life, no matter how crooked and distorted and ugly it appears to be, if it is reacted to in love and forgiveness and obedience to your will, can be transformed. Therefore I begin to think, my Lord, you purposely allow us to be brought into contact with the bad and evil things that you want changed. Perhaps that is the very reason why we are here in this world, where sin and sorrow and suffering and evil abound, so that we may let you teach us to react to them, that out of them we can create lovely qualities to live forever. It is the only real satisfactory way of dealing with evil, not simply binding it so that it cannot work harm, but whenever possible, overcoming it with good. At last he spoke. You have learned well, Grace and Glory. Now I will add one thing more. It was these lessons which you have learnt which enabled me to change you from limping, crippled, much afraid, into grace and glory with the Hinds' feet. Now you are able to run, leaping on the mountains, and able to follow me wherever I go, so that we need never be parted again. So remember this: as long as you are willing to be acceptance with joy and bearing in love, you can never again become crippled, and you will be able to go wherever I lead you. You will be able to go down into the valley of the world to work with me there, for that is where the evil and sorrowful and ugly things are which need to be overcome. Accept and bear and obey the law of love, and nothing will be able to cripple your Hinds' feet or separate you from me. This is the secret of the high places, Grace and Glory. It is the lovely and perfect law of the whole universe. It is this that makes the radiant joy of the heavenly places. Then he rose to his feet, drew her up beside him, and said, Now use your Hinds' feet again, for I am going to lead you to another part of the mountain. Off he went, leaping on the mountains and skipping on the hills, with Grace and Glory following close behind, and the beautiful figures of peace and joy springing at her side. As they went, she sang this song. Set me as a seal upon thine heart, thou love more strong than death, that I may feel through every part thy burning fiery breath, and then like wax held in the flame may take the imprint of thy name. Set me as a seal upon thine arm, thou love that bursts the grave, thy coals of fire can never harm, but only purge and save. Thou jealous love, thou burning flame, O burn out all unlike thy name. The floods can never drown thy love, nor weaken thy desire. The rains may deluge from above, but never quench thy fire. Make soft my heart in thy strong flame, to take the imprint of thy name. Have a wonderful day, friends. God bless you.